So you've already been introduced to me. I'm not going to spend an awfully long time telling you about kind of what I do at Iris Connect. What I am going to share, though, is a couple of things about roles that I have alongside here, because it will become clear once we start listening to this presentation why I'm so passionate about the subject I'm about to speak about. So I was an English teacher in a secondary school, a middle leader and a senior leader for the best part of 20 years. I left the classroom in 2021, just after the COVID-19 pandemic. So like many of you, worked all the way through that. According to the press, I was at home watching Netflix and having barbecues. Clearly that wasn't the case. It was probably the hardest 2 years of my life, like many people. And then I came and started working for Iris Connect in the University of Sunderland, where I led mentoring provision in the whole School of Education. And we had 1,000 mentors and 1,000 trainees. So huge amount of experience in the instructional coaching, the mentoring world. I am now a professor of coaching and mentoring at a university in Amsterdam. As well as my role at Iris Connect. And I also work for the Department for Education as well in the ITT department. So a lot of the policy that's coming through to schools, I've kind of had a hand in being involved in very much. Another role that I want to talk to you about, which really links to what I'm doing today, is that I'm a commissioner on the Teaching Commission. Some of you might have heard about the Teaching Commission. It's being led by Dr. Mary Boosted, who used to be the boss at NEU. Many of you will be familiar with, amazing woman. And we are a national organisation investigating teacher retention, okay? And I'm going to talk to you a lot about teacher retention today and the links to kind of, actually, how do we coach for agency to help retain teachers, because this is a huge, huge problem. And as Sam mentioned before, her and I are writing a book at the moment about teacher agency. We've interviewed way over 100 teachers of 20 plus years. We're more interested in experienced teachers and why they stay in the profession. Lots of research has been done on why teachers leave. We wanted to look at the opposite and why they stay and try to codify that a little bit. So we're furiously trying to finish that before April at the moment now, and hopefully that'll be out in the summer. So why am I talking about retention to do with coaching to start off with today? Well, we're in a bit of a dire situation at the moment with retention, aren't we? You've probably all seen the figures. 1 in 3 teachers leaving before they've seen out 5 years in the profession at the moment. And actually 40,000 experienced teachers left last year. And that was for reasons other than retirement. So lots of them have gone on to work in the wider education sector like me for various different organisations, gone into ITT, etc. So at the moment, the supply of teachers is not meeting the demand. And we've got colleagues here from Teach First, who I was chatting to before, who are also talking about this as well. It's a national problem, okay? It's not just regionalised to us in Manchester. And in fact, it's actually a global problem, colleagues, as well. I've been lucky enough to go and speak in America and Bangkok and China over the last 3 years, all suffering from huge teacher attrition issues as well. So I feel like there's been, the Department for Education, it's not fair to say that they've been sleepwalking into this crisis, because they haven't. In 2018, they launched their recruitment and retention strategy, which the early career framework and the MPQs came from that, okay? The market review in ITT came from that as well. Actually, but there's been lots of initiatives, but my thoughts are actually that to fix the shortage of teachers, I feel at the moment that the Department for Education are placing a much bigger focus on recruitment. And I feel like what they need to do is flip the narrative, because there's a huge, huge drain on retention at the moment with experienced teachers leaving the profession. And why is this really, really important? Well, because actually experienced teachers are the absolute stalwarts of the school, okay? They turn up day in, day out, year after year, okay, and get the business done. And without our experienced teachers in our classrooms, we risk losing the coaches that Sam was talking about, and the mentors, and those expert colleagues with that tacit experience to work with our new entrants into the profession. And I certainly remember when I started out 20 years ago in a school in Warrington called Sir Thomas Bottler. I absolutely loved that school. I was there for at least a decade. I loved that school, and I used to love going into the staff room and having the experienced teachers around me who could give me that informal coaching. If I'd had a bad lesson, you know, they could tell me about things that had worked for them. And I feel like we can't lose that. It's vital. That is the golden thread that runs through teaching. But actually, supporting ECTs and new teachers is not the only thing that we need experienced teachers for, because we all know the importance of explicit knowledge. Sam's talked a little bit about that before, with codifying that. But actually, for our novice teachers, you know, who don't possess the mental models, maybe, to make the right decisions, and we'll go back onto that a little bit later, we can codify, we can deconstruct things, we can practice that explicit knowledge. But tacit knowledge is also key. And what that refers to, actually, is the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities an individual gains through experience. And that's often really, really difficult to put into words or even communicate or codify. I often laugh and say, you know, we can't action step belonging, and it's absolutely true. So if we lose our experienced teachers, we actually risk losing that as well. And what a massive shame that would be. And there has been lots of research on this in the last few years. Tom Rees, who's now the CEO at Ormiston Academies Trust, but at this point was working at Ambition Institute, and Jen Barker wrote a brilliant paper about tacit knowledge transfer. And they were talking about how there's this idea of knowledge management and tacit expertise in schools. And they focused in this report on how schools can better capture and share that often quite deep unspoken knowledge held by experienced teachers. And some of the key insights from that really talk about the difference between that explicit knowledge, so that can be that codified knowledge, and that tacit knowledge, which is more experiential. And actually how we as schools can keep hold of that, so that when people retire, when people leave, we don't lose that resource. So if that's something you're interested in, I would definitely say to have a look at this paper. Now, there are massively inherent challenges in sharing tacit expertise, and one of those biggest challenges is actually that knowledge, as we say, is often very, very hard to articulate, and it requires kind of ongoing observation, reflection, and practice to be fully understood by others, and that's long. And sometimes in schools, you know, we all go into this profession to make a difference to children's lives, and we want impact yesterday, and we're always looking for that silver bullet. And sometimes things that take a long time, we wonder whether it's going to be worth the effort. But this paper essentially says it absolutely is. So Dylan Willem talks about loving the one that you're with, okay, as his strategy for retaining teachers. And that's actually the name of Sam and I's book. We've stolen it from Dylan. But the problem is actually that a lot of experienced teachers that we talk to don't feel very loved. So an example of that is the very recent pay increases that we've seen. ECTs have had an 8.9% increase in pay, whereas teachers with more experience have only had 5%. Okay, so that doesn't send a great message. So if you've been teaching sort of 5-6 years, there are some ECTs who are on more than you are now. Okay, and obviously we don't go into teaching to get rich. It's not for the pay, but we're living in a cost of living crisis, and these things do absolutely matter. We're a profession, we need to be paid and valued as such. So I wrote a book about this. It isn't a recent thing for me. This was my first book. I'm now on book number 7. And this was back in 2020. And I had been in a school and I'd been bullied by a toxic deputy head. And this book is all about how I carried on teaching, even though at the time I wanted to leave. And it's full of strategies about this. Lots of practical ways. And as part of writing this, I looked at some research that the Department for Education had done on why teachers leave the profession. Now, millions of pounds were spent on conducting this research. If they would have bunged me 10 quid, I could have told them, okay? So I'm going to ask you, does anyone want to shout out what some of the reasons why people leave might be? Yep. Yep. Anything else? Leadership, what was that one? Yeah. Any others? Now, interestingly, behaviour ranked really low on this, but that was in 2018. I think I'm in about 200 schools a year. I think it would rank much more highly now because obviously lots more pressures post-COVID with behaviour. So I think we've got a full bingo card pretty much, colleagues, okay? It's not difficult, is it? We all know what the challenges are with the jobs. It's also very predictable. Now, this kind of report what got me very, very interested in this concept of teacher autonomy, really. And this is from the National Foundation for Educational Research. And if you don't follow the NFER, or indeed Jack Worth, who I think is absolutely incredible, I would say absolutely go and follow Jack. So he's agreed to do the foreword for our book, which is very exciting. And this report, Teacher Autonomy, how does it relate to job satisfaction and retention, uncovered some really, really interesting things. So these are some of them. So uncovered that teachers are 16% less likely than similar professions to report having a lot of influence over how they do their job. Really interesting. That 38% of teachers said that they have little or no influence over their PD goals. Teacher autonomy is strongly associated with improved job satisfaction and greater intention to stay in teaching. And finally, increasing teachers' reported influence over their PD goals from some to a lot is associated with a 9 percentage point increase in intention to stay in teaching. So really, really interesting findings from this. And this kind of research really has been pretty much replicated in its findings by people like TeacherTapp, for example, as well in the last couple of months. So this is kind of the voice of the profession, really. This is what we are hearing from teachers. And it makes sense, doesn't it? You know, it links to the seminal SDT, self-determination theory by Deci and Ryan. This is an old piece of research now, but still so relevant. And what they say is that in order for teachers to have that intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, essentially they have to feel three things: competence, autonomy, and relatedness, okay? And this is intrinsically linked with agency, and hopefully intrinsically linked with coaching that I'm going to tell you about in a second. And Deci and Ryan talk about how if we have a greater reliance on intrinsic motivation, that is much more likely to lead to high well-being and job satisfaction. You can see if we just have that extrinsic motivation, it often leads to burnout and stress in teachers. And we will all have colleagues or felt like that ourselves at a point. So how do we kind of cultivate this self-determination, this feeling of competence, autonomy, relatedness? Sam used the words flourishing, belonging, all very much in the same wheelhouse and family. Well, I believe it's absolutely through autonomy, okay, and teacher agency. So it's this idea of how can we help our teachers have professional choice over their own PD? How can we involve teachers in the decision-making in our school? And Sam talked really clearly about how all the teachers in her school have been involved when she was creating this culture. And how do we provide teachers the freedom to experiment, to hold things lightly, to face ambiguity and complexity? Because we know there's no one size fits all, okay? There's no silver bullet. How do we help? And also, if you're leading PD in a school, how do you design PD sessions that are not only relevant, but are practical as well? I can't count the amount of PD sessions in a hall that I've sat through, you know, and come away with reams and reams of notes, but I absolutely didn't bridge that knowing-doing gap. I went away and never read those notes again. Teachers' habits are really, really difficult to change. How do we help teachers feel capable and respected? And how do we celebrate successes? And that means recognising those both big and small wins. And finally, how do we build that supportive culture where staff feel comfortable sharing their ideas? How do we create a sense of belonging and reduce isolation? Because teaching can be a really lonely job. You know, I spent the majority of my days in my classroom with children. I had sort of a 10-minute break where I ran to the loo, and then at lunch, 25 minutes. And by the time you've eaten, you're back. It can feel quite isolating. And how do we encourage collaboration and connection, okay? So I've used two words there. I've used autonomy and agency, and lots of people say to me, well, aren't they the same thing, okay? Well, actually, when you delve into the research, not quite, okay? So when we talk about teacher autonomy, that often focuses on those external freedoms that are granted to teachers by systems or institutions. So, for example, the national curriculum. It often relates to the structure of the education system. So is it centralised? Is it decentralised? I know lots of multi-academy trusts, for example, are moving towards a model that is much more decentralised rather than a top-down approach. And that is very much linked to all of this talk about agency and belonging as well. I was speaking to a deputy CEO of a huge multi-academy trust, and they're going through this journey at the moment. And then with autonomy, that can be limited or expanded by the policies, by the leadership and the school culture that you're in. Okay, so how is agency different? Well, agency focuses on the internal capacity, okay, in your mat, in your school. So it's all about professional empowerment. And it involves that idea of taking ownership of your own actions, which then I very much think, and the research tells us, relates to adaptive expertise. And I'm going to talk more about adaptive expertise in just a second, that it's this idea where teachers can navigate the constraints they find themselves in, because there are plenty, and make informed decisions, okay? So we've got kind of So what's the value of agency and autonomy then, and how does it kind of link to what I'm talking about with retention and coaching? Well, we know from some of the research there from NFER, and there's more here that you can see, that it closely correlates with increased motivation, job satisfaction and retention as well. And what it does is it helps teachers to adapt their PD to their own persistent problems, so their own unique classroom and student needs. Sam talked about before, you know, if coaching is the question, then if coaching is the answer, what's the question? She said she thought she got that from me. She didn't. I nearly took responsibility for it because it sounds very clever, but actually it's a really interesting thought, isn't it? Okay. And then it builds that trust very much of culture, of trust and professionalism, okay? So I think this goes back to us thinking about actually what do we want for the teachers that we train, okay? And I've got a little bit of an idea there. I think the end goal that we want is teachers who have both the knowledge, the skills, and actually the disposition to improve in an environment that affords them the agency to do so, okay? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes on your tables. Is there anything else we want for the teachers we train? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Then we'll come back together. Okay. So, we've got knowledge, we've got skills, we've got the disposition, the motivation, if you like, to want to improve, and we've got an environment that affords them the agency to do so. Have I missed anything off? Is there anything else? Comprehensive? Completed it, mate. I'm happy. Okay, what do you think, boss? Anything else?
We were just discussing that skill is an interesting word because it's not technique, it's skill. So we were talking about football. Well, I read recently from a football coach who was saying that
it's always sports analogies.
Yeah, no, that's all I got. That's all I got. So, but he was basically saying that like technique is like ball control and shooting and passing accurately. These are techniques. But then when you watch a skillful player, they're the one who sort of sees the ball, moves into the box at the right time, controls the ball into the right space, and then shoots left because the goalie's weight was right. He's used all the techniques, but he's done it in service of responding to his environment and his goals, his objectives in that scenario. And I think that it's just really important that we emphasise that we're a bit shy of the word skills in education these days. And I feel like this is really important when we're talking about this sort of adaptive expertise that we want teachers to be able to apply.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a point that I'll come back to in a second. So it's not just this idea of kind of, obviously practicing techniques is massively important. Breaking them down into steps really, really helps with cognitive load and helps with the practicing and granularizing. But actually it's more than that. Okay, and that's something we'll come on to in a sec. So if we think of our end goal, I'm going to have a teacher in mind here, Jo. And what Jo has is a deep knowledge of her subject, the curriculum and her students. Okay, she's a great teacher. She's got a repertoire of teaching techniques, and I think that's really important. Years ago when I trained to teach on my PGCE, we used to talk about Bernstein and the repertoire and reservoir idea of teaching techniques. And it's kind of gone out of fashion a little bit now, but I think it's still really a valid point. And they need something else, okay, which I think is kind of what Andy was alluding to there. And that's this idea of situational awareness, okay? There's lots of papers being written about this at the moment in teaching. It's a real buzzword. So it's this ability, if you like, to be able to size up a situation, be that an approximation or something that's actually has happened, and select, okay, from that repertoire of strategies. And obviously we still need that knowing how to improve and being motivated to do so as well. Because I've worked with some colleagues who are actually really great teachers, but they're not very motivated to want to change because it's worked for them for years and they're fine, okay? So to quote Andy here, what we want is teachers who do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons, okay? And that is kind of what we mean when we talk about this phrase, adaptive expertise, okay? So adaptive expertise, what it does is it contrasts to routine expertise, okay? So what we're not saying is that teachers go straight to adaptive expertise and they jump over the routine expertise phase. Actually, they need to be able to still have those core competencies, but what they need to be able to be flexible and adapt in the moment is that ability to size up situations that we're talking about, okay? And there's a quote here from a great piece of research on this. When routine expertise involves the efficient and precise execution of predetermined behaviours, adaptive expertise involves the thoughtful and innovative exercising of judgment in practice. Okay, lovely quote. So it's essentially a different way of viewing the role of a teacher. It's the role of a teacher as a flexible, adaptive expert who can make decisions in the moment based on their expertise. And it also appeals to teachers who see their job and their role as part of this continuous improvement that they do career long. And they're not thinking kind of, you know, I'm done now, I'm the finished article. They're constantly seeking improvement and solving novel problems that come across to them. Because even after teaching for almost 20 years, I still got to September and still had to struggle till Christmas with behaviour with my classes, no matter how long you've been teaching. So we will always come across novel problems in our teaching. Okay, but as we've said a couple of times now, and I keep repeating this because actually it's really important, if we're working in schools that don't have the environment, okay, that gives teachers agency to be able to improve, none of this matters, okay? It's not going to help. So why do teachers need adaptive expertise? Okay, well, because teaching is really, really hard. So very recently, I heard, so I think it was Daisy Christodoulou, who was at a conference, talking about likening teaching to brain surgery, and actually saying that it's harder than brain surgery in a way, because when a surgeon opens somebody's head, they can see the brain and they can see what they're doing with it, whereas we cannot see the brain of our students. Okay, so it's much, much more complex. There are lots and lots of different interactions, emergent properties. Okay, an example of that might be explaining something to a student, and that might lead to multiple different interpretations of the idea because the student has differing prior knowledge. Okay, so it's always going to be very, very complex. So part of this is to do with cause and effect. So it's really, really difficult in teaching, isn't it, to work out exactly what caused something, because it could have been multiple different things. So for example, you know, my students didn't understand an idea. Were some of them taught it differently last year? Was the teacher's explanation too rushed? Was the question that the teacher asked to check if they understood it too confusing? Were they not paying attention? It's actually possible to have multiple different interpretations of situations, because teaching is really ambiguous, and so are the decisions that we make as well. And secondly, complexity makes it really difficult to predict beyond the short term in teaching as well. And that means there's a degree of kind of unpredictability that we face in our lessons. Anyone who's ever tried to stick to a lesson plan will have experienced that. Okay, so that flexibility is really, really key in the face of unpredictability. And that unpredictability means that we actually have to be tentative about what we trial in the classroom and sensitive to different cues that tell us to act in different ways. Okay. So in order to build the knowledge, the skills, the situational awareness and the understanding and motivation to improve, what we spoke about earlier, what we benefit from is understanding kind of the cognitive processes that sit beneath that. And some of that is to do with mental models, okay? And as I said, go to hundreds of schools. I watch lots of coaching conversations. And what I've seen, and I think Sam alluded to this a little bit earlier, is some quite worrying coaching conversations where I sit and a coach dictates to a coachee what they did well in their lesson, what needs to improve and how they need to do it. And the coachee literally sits there and says one word, if that. Okay, the last time I saw this happen was a few months ago, and literally coach giving really great ideas and expertise, but the coachee was so disempowered and just went, yeah, okay. So even if you're following a framework like the PEAS model that Sam talked about earlier, the second step of that model is probe. We should be asking our coachees probing questions to elicit their understanding from their mental models, okay? Now, Jim Knight invented instructional coaching, and there's a bit of a miscommunication, I think, about what instructional coaching means in this country, because it doesn't mean telling a teacher what to do, okay? Instruction means teaching in America. So it's this idea of a coach never withholds their expertise if it's needed. Jim Knight says that himself, but actually we need to give a teacher time through dialogue, maybe through video, to probe their own mental model and to make it visible, okay? And then you can adapt and make your mental model visible as a coach as well. So massively, massively important. Now, we believe that decision-making is at the heart of adaptive expertise and also at the heart of coaching for teacher agency as well. And that's why we have launched today our new model of instructional coaching, and it's called the LEARN model, okay? So like all good models, it's an acronym and stands for things. So we have learn from success, examine the challenge, action step, rehearse, model and practice, and nurture improvement, okay? Now, as you can see, this is quite similar in many ways, actually, to many instructional coaching frameworks that are out there. And the reason for that is that this is incredibly evidence-based. It's based on the 14 mechanisms for behaviour change from the EEF's PD report, okay? So you're always going to get the same steps in this kind of coaching, but we're sort of framing this slightly differently alongside this idea that we need that tight but loose, that holding things lightly, that probing of mental models, okay, that dialogue that's massively important. So I'm going to delve into a couple of these in a little bit more depth. And later on when Andy speaks, he's going to show you our AI version of this, okay, our coaching pathway, which I think will give you a bit more of an insight into what this looks like in action. So let's start off with learning from success. Now, very often in traditional instructional coaching models, this part will be the praise, okay? So this would be the bit where you tell them what they did well, okay? That's massively important. And Bambrick Santoyo talks about praise being as precise as possible, okay? So that we can help build teachers' mental models and help move towards automaticity. Now, that's great because what we're doing there is reinforcing the behaviour, all right? We're starting with something really positive. So it might look something like this. It was really effective when you use cold call. You put the name last and that meant everyone had to think, okay? So Bambrick Santoyo refers to it as narrating the positive, all right? And that's what we've got. However, we're doing it slightly differently, okay? So we can still praise, absolutely. That's a fundamental part of relationship building and belonging. But actually what we want to do in Learn from Success is spend this time working out if they're doing the right thing at the right time for the right reason. And you cannot do that if you are dictating to somebody what they did well in a lesson, okay? So an example of that. You use cold calling really effectively. You've still got the praise. Now, tell me about why you chose to use cold calling then. What features of the technique did you use effectively? What effect did it have on students? And when wouldn't you use cold call? Okay, can you see the difference between that and telling somebody they did something really well and moving on to the next part of the coaching? Okay, there's a huge, huge difference. And of course, we are not saying that coaches sit idly by rubbing somebody's back if they're not getting it. That is not what we're saying. Teachers and leaders in school are incredibly time poor, okay? Coaches, as we say, do not withhold their expertise if it's needed, and they will share their mental model when necessary. So a teacher might respond as something like this. I'm not going to read it out, I'll let you have a look at it. Okay, so I'm going to ask you on your table, from that teacher response there, do you think that teacher is more likely to use that technique at the right time for the right reasons from their response? And how do you know? 2 minutes. Okay, thanks, colleagues. I'm very tight on time and I've got a couple more slides to get through on this to look at the rest of the Learn model. I'm going to really embarrass them now. I've got two colleagues there in the middle. You can see them looking at me like, please don't. And they've done absolutely brilliant examples of coaching conversations that if any of you have done the MPQs with Teach First, you will have seen, because I felt like I knew them when I came into the room. So I literally went straight over almost asking them for autographs because I've seen the videos so much. So this is how you coach anyway. I've seen it. But unfortunately, this isn't what is happening over a lot of the country when I go into schools. And that isn't because people are purposefully going into schools going, oh, well, I'm going to disempower teachers now. It's because when we roll out things at scale into schools, we tend to steamroll the complexity out of it to make them easier, okay? And it's just a lethal mutation. So tell me about what you think. Will that teacher get that technique more, using it for the right time, for the right reasons? How do you know?
Yeah, so we're saying the questions encourage reflective thinking, so they are actively thinking about how that technique has impacted the students and their ability to learn and not be overloaded. So rather than you telling them, you're encouraging that active recognition of why it's been impactful in their lesson, and therefore more likely to implement it at the appropriate time to get the good outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting. In my opinion, with the sort of thousands of new teachers that I have access to every year, I think we have teachers now that are coming through the profession who are more knowledgeable about evidence than any that I've ever seen in my life, so much so that I'm often working with mentors to try to get them up to the same level, to be honest. But teachers coming through can cite Rosenshine's principles of instruction verbatim is not going to do them any good if they cannot bridge that knowing-doing gap. And actually, it's about how do we take that knowledge and how do we actually change their habits, okay? And I think this Learn model really helps with that, because it's very much around that idea of decision-making, essentially, and doing that through dialogue and sharing and probing mental models of coach and coachee. So the next letter in the Learn model is this idea of examining the challenge, okay? So we will all have lots of different challenges in our classrooms. Some of those challenges might be persistent. They come up, for a longer period of time. Some might be something that we can solve quite quickly. So it's this idea we might review what the challenge was in the previous coaching conversation, because we see coaching as iterative. They're not one-off standalone events. We might discuss some of the successes and challenges that they've come across since the last time, and we would set a new action step. Okay, and on our pathways, Andy will show them to you later. We have all sorts of materials that can help coaches with this, including new technique guides, theory guides that pretty much cover, I would say, Andy, most of the persistent problems that teachers might come across. It's an iterative work in progress, though, and we're always looking for more. So if you go on and have a look and say, oh, actually, you've got nothing for this, do let me know and we'll build something. And then we hone in, okay? We hone in into our area of focus, and that's that time there for that dialogue, those coaching conversations that Sam was talking about before that are so important. So we will, at that point, identify the area of focus, and that might be led by the coach, it might be led by the coachee, dependent on where they are. And we'll discuss those challenges. Now, as the EF state, rehearsal is incredibly important. We see rehearsal as not just out of context practice, but actually in practice as well, in classrooms with students in front of you. And also that could be approximations or scenarios, and cognitive rehearsal as well, of shared planning or talking through things. So rehearsal is very much multifaceted. And you need the chance to be able to do this to work towards that flexibility that we need for the decision making. Okay, so again, tight but loose, holding things tentatively during this stage, experimenting. And then we finish with the nurture the change. So as part of the rehearsal, the coach will provide feedback for multiple different bats of the teacher rehearsing and trying things out as well. And that will lead on to then some in-class practice that they can give them some feedback on, and we start again on the coaching framework. Okay, so I hope you can see kind of the differences there between more directive forms of instructional coaching and this that is very much based on mental models, on dialogue, okay, on probing, on empowering our teachers and giving them a voice, not just doing to them. So obviously teachers need the agency to improve as part of this, and I just want to kind of finish on this slide before my summary. So coaching provides an opportunity, if done well, to be able to do all of these things, to explore complexity, to think about ambiguity and unpredictability through coaching conversations. Coaching provides the opportunity to be tentative, to have those discussions, and then actually to reshape your thoughts in the light of data from lesson observations or videos of classroom practice. And ultimately, coaching for me is about experimentation alongside a colleague. So it's that opportunity to predict things, okay, whether that be through scenarios or questions like we saw before, to test things, to refine things, okay, to be able to go into the classroom as a teacher who feels they have the agency to improve, they're empowered, and they can use their expertise to become an adaptive expert. So here's my summary. This very much leads on later on to Andy showing you the coaching pathway. You've kind of heard the rationale behind it now and why we've gone down this direction. And hopefully it's expressed to you really that actually we believe coaching needs to centre around mental models to create teachers with agency who are empowered and can become adaptive experts. Lots and lots of references on the end of the slide there. And as I say, you will get these directly from our colleagues at Iris Connect. But thank you so much for listening.